164. Part 2. The Trump-Netanyahu Deal 1. When, after 3 years of fanfare, the administration of President Donald Trump released its proposed plan for peace between the Palestinian people and Israel, its substance came as no surprise, exceeding expectations only in how closely it hewed to the discourse of the Israeli right. Details of the political portion of the plan were announced on the 28th of January 2020, some 8 months after the economic portion was made public at a workshop in the Bahraini capital of Manama in June 2019. These two parts, the political and the economic, together constituted the plan, officially titled Peace to Prosperity, a vision to improve the lives of the Palestinian and Israeli people. With his typical bombast, Trump called it their deal of the century. I prefer the Trump-Netanyahu deal. The document is merely a political initiative, not an agreement or treaty binding on future US presidents. Even so, it set a dangerous precedent by accepting and legitimizing the facts on the ground created by the occupation, taking the status quo as its starting point. Consider, for example, the question of Jerusalem. Without an act of Congress, it may be impossible for any future president to reverse Trump's decision to relocate the U.S. Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, since the move came in pursuance of existing legislation, pressed for by the Israeli lobby, although not previously implemented by the White House. The Trump administration enthusiastically endorsed and helped reinforce the power politics approach that dominates Israeli political culture. It is instructive to compare this to the approach of former President George H. W. Bush, 1989 to 1993. As a way of exerting pressure on then Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Shamir, Bush threatened to withhold the guarantees for a $10 billion loan to Israel. Shamir buckled to the pressure, ending the 1991 Madrid Peace Conference before receiving the necessary guarantees, which were not released until Yitzhak Rabin was elected prime minister in 1992. The Bush administration's position had an impact on the outcome of the 1992 Israeli elections, contributing to the Likud party's loss for the first time since 1977. In contrast, by comparison, the Trump-Netanyahu deal clearly inhabits a new, early different political context and culture. It cannot be understood apart. 165. From developments within American politics and culture in the post-Obama era, for or without consideration for the radical right-wing sailors and evangelicals that surrounded Trump, who, despite his right-wing populist inclinations, was himself politically vacuous. This chapter builds on a lecture I delivered at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies on the 3rd of February 2020 on President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's plan to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. See Azmi Bishra, Trump-Netanyahu deal. The American-Israeli right-wing plan to end the Palestinian cause in a historical context, Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies YouTube channel, the 6th of February 2020, accessed at hp://bit.ly/2HOR7WJ2 on the 23rd of October 1995. Both houses of Congress overwhelmingly passed the Jerusalem Embassy Act, mandating that the United States Embassy in Israel should be established in Jerusalem no later than the 31st of May 1999. However, the act allowed the president to invoke a 6-month renewable waiver of the application of the law on a national security grounds, and Presidents Clinton, Bush and Obama repeatedly did so. On the 6th of December 2017, Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and ordered the relocation of the embassy, which was officially completed on the 14th of May 2018. See S.1322 Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995, Congress.Government, accessed at hp://bit.ly/2Hoshero3. Shamir insisted that Israel would not negotiate, directly or indirectly, with the PLO or anyone affiliated with it, and further demanded the exclusion of Palestinians residing in East Jerusalem from the negotiations. The PLO agreed to these terms, limiting itself to presenting a list of Palestinians from the occupied territories to participate in the negotiations. Before initiating talks, Israel further demanded that the Palestinian delegation formally acknowledge that the scope of negotiations be limited to autonomy in the Palestinian territories. Feeling that this rigid approach would make talks impossible, former Secretary of State James Baker sent a message to the Israeli government essentially telling them to call us when you are serious about peace. See Omar L. Friedman. Baker rebukes Israel on peace terms. New York Times, the 14th of June 1990, accessed at hps://niti.ms/3uqqte5. President George H.W. Bush subsequently indicated that he would look into other ways to proceed towards a peace plan, because we're not going to sit here and do nothing. George H.W. Bush, President's New Conference, June 29, 1990, in Public Papers of the President of the United States, George Bush, 1990, book I, the 1st January to the 30th of June 1990, Washington, D.C., United States Government Printing Office, 1991, page 882. In September 1991, tensions between Bush and Shamir reached a breaking point. Hours before the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. presented a formal request for the loan guarantees, Bush took the unusual step of holding a press conference, during which he asked Congress to hold off on any action on the request for 120 days. He had previously called on Israel to freeze settlements in the occupied territories and indicated that he would not consider Israeli requests for loan guarantees until after the Madrid peace. 166. Conference, slated for October 1991. He also threatened to exercise his presidential veto if Congress denied his request, but that proved unnecessary. He additionally refused to promise that the loan guarantees would be approved after the 120 days, conditioning them on progress at the Madrid Peace Conference and an end to settlements. Shamir ignored these threats, although he made conciliatory gestures to the U.S. and affirmed his support of the proposed peace conference. He asserted that Israel would be ready to GHT Abir Biala if it came to that. A loan guarantee issue persisted at the Madrid conference as Bush continued to make them contingent on an end to settlement construction, which his administration considered a hindrance to peace. Ultimately, Bush withheld the loan guarantees for a year, until Rabin's election in the summer of 1992. These developments include the fraught debate around populism and neoliberalism and their interconnectedness, the consequences of previous U.S. wars abroad and disagreement over what they mean, and the responses to Trump's election, which itself was a reaction to Obama's presidency. Although it is important to understand the Trump-Netanyahu deal within the U.S. context, such consideration is outside the scope of this study. Trump's vision is indeed a result of fractures in U.S. domestic politics, populist and white supremacist reactions to Obama's term, the rising influence of Christian Zionism in American evangelicalism, and the increasing electoral and foreign policy activism of radical evangelical churches and their links with the Israeli lobby, with significant implications for the Middle East. 167. 7. Zionist religious nationalist discourse. An official American text starting scratch. Before delving into Peace to Prosperity, it may be useful to briefly review U.S. peace initiatives since 1967. Such an overview will show that Trump's vision constituted a crucial share from a strategic alliance with Israel and unconditional commitment to its security to outright identification with the Israeli right, the embrace of its language and arguments, and the aspiration to impose its positions on Palestinians and Arab states. With this transformation, the U.S. completely abandoned its role as a mediator in negotiations or custodian of the so-called peace process. This overview will spotlight the respective positions of the Arab world and Israel towards these American initiatives, demonstrating that the ostensible Arab rejection of peace is nothing more than a myth. The persistent rejecter has been Israel. My goal in focusing on Israeli intransigence is to refute the lies that justify support for the so-called deal of the century. So, for example, the Arabs and Palestinians in particular are blamed for their supposedly persistent rejectionist positions, which pro-Trump Arab states sought to deny by eagerly supporting normalization with the occupying state before it recognized Palestinian rights and accepted a just solution to the Palestinian issue. The truth is that Arab states have consistently signed onto previous peace initiatives. The problem with Arab states has never been their implacable rejectionism, quite the contrary, it has been their desire to please. Furthermore, in trying to resolve the cognitive dissonance between their behavior and their upbringing, proponents of normalizing relations with Israel often vilify Palestinians, making unfounded accusations against them, e.g., the repeated claim that they sold their land. It is important to emphasize this point, because in justifying normalization with Israel, some Arab politicians parrot the typical Israeli lie that Palestinians and Arabs have always rejected peace initiatives while Israel has accepted them. 5. This myth has plagued Arabs since the Zionist movement agreed to their 1947 partition plan, UNGA Resolution 181-6, which granted it a land and a state, while Arabs, and not just Palestinians, rejected the plan because it 168 entailed the establishment of a settler state on territory overwhelmingly inhabited by Arabs. At that point in time, it was only to be expected that the owner of the land would balk at such a division, especially since the immigrant settler did not just intend to live on the land, but also to establish a state designed to exclude its indigenous inhabitants. By the same token, the Zionist movement naturally accepted that same plan because it helped it accomplish, even if only partially, its primary goal of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine, despite Jews, including new settlers, constituting a minority of Palestine's inhabitants. Yishuv leadership embraced partition as a provisional solution, actually an expedient, a way to gain international legitimacy for a Jewish state in Palestine, before expanding to occupy the rest of the country and expelling its inhabitants, ostensibly in response to the Arab intervention, which was itself triggered by ethnic cleansing and the unilateral declaration of a Jewish state prior to the creation of an international mechanism to implement the partition plan. While the US has always been absolutely partial to Israel, it has tried to mediate the CON-ICT when Egypt moved to alignment with the US and was ready for separate peace with Israel, and when Syria and the PLO proved receptive to the idea, particularly after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the 1989 collapse of the socialist bloc and the rise of unipolarity, and the Iraqi occupation of Kuwait, where the formation of an international alliance to liberate the country included Arab states. Successive US peace initiatives have assumed an identifiable template, with each one predictably building on its predecessor. In contrast, the Trump-Netanyahu deal started from scratch, effectively wiping the slate clean. Early US initiatives after the 1967 occupation did not address the Palestinian issue and of course did not deal with the PLO, which was considered a terrorist organization. First of these, the Rogers Plan, was proposed in June 1970. Named after Nixon's Secretary of State William Rogers. 7. It reduced the CON-ICT to the June 1967 war and its aftermath, that is, to the issue of the territories occupied in 1967, with reference to a compromise on the issue of the 1948 refugees. Based on UN Security Council Resolution 242, issued on the 22nd of November 1967, it called for Arab recognition of Israel and the return to Jordan, Egypt and Syria of the territories occupied in the 1967 war. 9. Israel rejected the plan, asserting that it did not. 169. Sufficiently address its security needs and lacked guiding principles for direct negotiations leading to an official peace treaty. Moreover, the plan's demand for withdrawal from occupied territory might include occupied East Jerusalem, which was unacceptable to Israel. 10. ERST-US initiative or the 1967 war, which was based on UN Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338, was thus accepted by Egypt and Jordan, but rebuffed by Israel. As for Palestinians, the Rogers Plan neither addressed nor recognized them. In contrast, Arab states have accepted US peace initiatives, despite the so-called "Renos of Khartoum" or the 1967 defeat. Renos did not, as his OEN claimed, represent a new position or coherent political program. They simply reiterated the existing positions of Arab states decrying the outcome of a war of aggression, namely, the Israeli military occupation of Arab lands. Let us now move on to the second US initiative, spearheaded by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who served as National Security Advisor to President Jimmy Carter from 1977 to 1981. Brzezinski's initiative was, RST and foremost, a plan for autonomy in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Was the RST formal US proposal for establishing Palestinian autonomy, though the autonomous territories were to be linked with Jordan. Israel rejected the plan because Carter did not commit to guarantees for Israel if it made any concessions during negotiations. 11. At the insistence of Egyptian President Sadat, 12. A clause on Palestine was added to the Camp David Accords, allowing him to save face and avoid the public appearance of completely abandoning the Palestinian cause, the ostensible crux of the CON-ICT. Pursuant to approval from his counterpart, Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin, a proposal was oat for autonomy for the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, with no reference to a Palestinian state. A peace agreement stated, Egypt and Israel agree that, in order to ensure a peaceful and orderly transfer of authority, and taking into account the security concerns of all the parties, there should be transitional arrangements for the West Bank and Gaza for a period not exceeding 20 years. To negotiate the details of a transitional arrangement, Jordan will be invited to join the negotiations on the basis of this framework. These new arrangements should give due consideration both to the principle of self-government by their inhabitants of these territories and to the legitimate security concerns of their 170 parties involved. 13. Despite this provision, everyone involved was aware that the idea of Palestinian autonomy had been graded onto the treaty as a mere formality, and it was notably devoid of any Israeli recognition of the established Palestinian leadership. A third plan, an American peace initiative for the long-suffering peoples of the Middle East, came in 1982 under the administration of Ronald Reagan. 14. Reagan's initiative outlined an executive framework for a solution based on Palestinian autonomy in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, whereby Palestinians would manage their own internal affairs provided they did not pose a threat to Israel. There was no mention of a Palestinian state. The initiative stipulated that Palestinian autonomy be tied to Jordan and that settlement activities be frozen for 5 years. Reagan explicitly affirmed that the US would not support the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Even so, Begin rejected the proposal, describing it as stillborn and maintaining that Reagan, simply by suggesting Palestinian autonomy, had betrayed the friendship between the US and Israel. 15. The initiative came as Israel's wanton militarism, exemplified by Ariel Sharon, and the chauvinism of the Israeli right, embodied by Begin, were at their peak, just a few months after the Israeli army invaded Lebanon and laid siege to the PLO in Beirut, a time when the promise of Israeli victory was still alive. A sea change occurred in the Arab world and the region following the Second Gulf War, the 7th of August 1990 to the 28th of February 1991. With that reckless, arrogant action, the Iraqi regime committed a lethal mistake, wronging not only Kuwait but also Iraq itself and putting the nail in the coffin of Arab national security and the prevailing Arab regional order. 16. The international and regional order shared, allowing regional powers like Turkey, Iran and Israel to step in during the subsequent historical phase and extend their influence across the Arab world, absent of any single Arab state with comparable power on the one hand and devoid of any collective national security arrangement on the other. On the 6th of March 1991, having assumed office in what would soon be the world's only superpower, the now toothless Soviet Union was to collapse. A few months later, George H.W. Bush announced a new vision for peace before Congress that would evolve into the Fourth U.S. Initiative. American efforts to drum up support for a war of liberation against an occupying power. 171. Had led to accusations of double standards, and Bush had promised Arab states joining the anti-Iraq coalition that he would turn his attention to the Palestine issue as soon as Iraqi forces had been expelled from Kuwait. A comprehensive peace must be grounded in United Nations Security Council Resolutions 242 and 338 and the principle of territory for peace. 17. Bush said. Although he presented no concrete proposal, he sent Secretary of State James Baker on Shula diplomacy trips around the region, which ultimately led to the 1991 Madrid negotiations between Israel, Syria, Jordan and the Palestinians. EPLO did not directly participate in the negotiations due to Israeli taboos, but directly appointed the Palestinian delegation consisting of public figures from the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. Baker's point man on these Shula trips was Dennis Ross, who proved extremely adept at undermining peace negotiations over multiple U.S. administrations by working consistently to adjust them to the Israeli positions. Indeed, Ross's role exemplifies as the impact of the Israeli lobby on successive administrations' decisions regarding Palestine and the Arab-Israeli conflict. Contrary to popular opinion, the Israeli lobby does not limit its efforts to Congress. 18. Madrid negotiations ultimately led nowhere, partly due to Israeli refusals to engage with the Palestinian team. Although the PLO was not officially present at the talks, it was common knowledge that it had directly appointed the Palestinian delegation. Menahem Begin's successor, Yitzhak Shamir, subsequently lost the elections and the Labour Party once again assumed power, this time under the leadership of Yitzhak Rabin. With Rabin's reluctant approval, Minister of Foreign Affairs Shimon Peres pursued a new negotiation path in Oslo, opening a direct channel between Israel and the PLO. Oslo negotiations ran parallel to the Madrid talks and were not ended by the United States, at least not formally. While Rabin had wanted, and failed, to reach a bilateral peace agreement with Syria RST, he gave Peres the green light for the Oslo tracker, realizing that the alternative to talks with civil activists and PLO-appointed delegates would be Hamas. Oslo talks were thus a direct result of the RST Intifada, the Palestinian peaceful uprising and civil disobedience movement. Although by this time, the movement was turning towards violence as mass participation caved into fatigue, the severe economic repercussions of lengthy general strikes, and regional and global developments. 172. As negotiations began in Oslo, the PLO found itself in a double bind. Its 1982 expulsion from Lebanon, the 1991 Palestinian exodus from Kuwait, and strained relations with the Gulf countries due to Yasser Arafat's expressed solidarity with Iraq during the Kuwait crisis all coincided with the collapse of the Arab regional order. Moreover, while the 1987 Intifada had made impressive achievements, it had exhausted its potential and was overtaken by historic events, namely, the collapse of the Soviet Union and the 1990-1 Gulf War. EPLO, headquartered in Tunis with no financial support from the Gulf countries or the Soviet Union, was forced to try to salvage its position, particularly in light of the de facto end of the RST Intifada. It was now not only ready to make peace with Israel, it had been prepared to accept a two-state solution since the late 1970s, but willing to amend the Palestinian National Covenant and to engage in security coordination with Israel, all in exchange for formal recognition of the PLO and the establishment of a Palestinian Authority in the West Bank and Gaza, with no corollary promise of an independent Palestinian state. Let us now move on to the HUS initiative, that of US President George W. Bush, Jr., whose roadmap for peace provided for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state. Based on this vision, a diplomatic quartet was formed consisting of the US, Russia, the European Union and the United Nations. A roadmap was introduced in October 2002, in the midst of the Second Intifada and during Ariel Sharon's tenure as Prime Minister, 2001-6. A Palestinian leadership accepted the roadmap without reservation, while the Israeli government accepted it in principle with 14 reservations, which in practical terms amounted to rejection. In order to take the roadmap entirely off the table and seize the initiative from the US, Sharon unilaterally decided in 2005 to withdraw from the Gaza Strip with no prior agreement with the PA. By withdrawing from Gaza, he signaled that Israel, not the US, would set the pace and act as its sortie. A narrow, densely populated strip of land, Gaza has few resources and no promising future for settlements, and is also a center of active resistance against the occupation. Consequently, it was in Israel's interest to rid itself of both Gaza and the roadmap. 19 By taking this step, it sought to solve its own problem in Gaza, but not Gaza's problem nor that of the rest of the Palestinian territories. 173. As Prime Minister, Sharon pursued a two-pronged strategy to establish new realities on the ground. First, he waged total war on the Palestinian Authority, invading Ramallah in 2002 and assassinating Yasser Arafat in 2004. Second, he withdrew unilaterally from the Gaza Strip, relieving Israel of the demographic burden of a mass of Palestinians resisting the occupation, and then besieged it. Arafat, who agreed to the roadmap with no amendments, was assassinated by Israel. In contrast, Sharon, who rejected the roadmap, received a letter from Bush in 2005 promising Israel security guarantees and expressing support for its unilateral withdrawal from Gaza. The letter contained a key sentence suggesting that it was unrealistic to expect Israel to withdraw from all of the occupied territories and return to the 1949 Armistice Agreement borders under any future peace agreement, implying that the US was committed to a policy of border adjustments. 26th round of US diplomatic initiatives was the so-called Road to Peace under President Barack Obama. In a speech delivered at Cairo University a few months after taking office in 2009, he announced that he would dedicate himself to pursuing peace between Palestinians and Israelis, with all the patience that the task requires. 21 His patience soon wore thin. More importantly, he sought to avoid any head-on confrontation with the Israeli lobby on the Palestinian issue, only showing a limited willingness to defy the lobby when negotiating the nuclear agreement with Iran. During Obama's second term, Secretary of State John Kerry assumed responsibility for the peace process. Upon taking office, Kerry arranged a meeting at the White House, led by Obama, between Mahmoud Abbas and Benjamin Netanyahu. The informal talks immediately crumbled because Netanyahu refused to freeze settlements, which up until that point the US had deemed illegal and an obstacle to peace. And that was that. Obama subsequently avoided any direct engagement with the peace process, turning it entirely over to Kerry with the knowledge that his diplomatic efforts would amount to nothing and that there was no hope of any exability from Netanyahu. Obama's plan called for the establishment of a Palestinian state within the 1967 borders and including the West Bank, the Gaza Strip and East Jerusalem, but Netanyahu rejected the proposal. referring to Bush's letter to Sharon recognizing the unfeasibility of a return to the 1967. 174. Borders. Netanyahu suggested that Obama was breaking a decades-old American commitment to Israel on this point. 22. On the 23rd of September 2011, the quartet released a plan to resuscitate peace talks. 23. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority applied to join the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO. Opposed to any attempt by the PA to join any international organization, including UNESCO, Israel responded by establishing 2,000 new settlement units. In 2013, Kerry made several official visits, but presented no actionable initiatives. A relatively advanced proposal was out in 2016, just before the conclusion of Obama's presidential term and his own term as Secretary of State, in other words, when it was too late. Neither Kerry nor Obama attempted to pressure or impose terms on Israel. On the contrary, Israel was rewarded for its intransigence. 24. In public remarks, Kerry outlined 6 principles underlying his last proposed program, including the two-state solution framework with land swaps based on the 1967 borders and previous UN resolutions related to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, including secure borders for both sides. 25. Kerry's speech on the 2016 plan contains multiple references to satisfying Israel's security needs. Indeed, the proposal was predicated on the need to protect Israel's Jewish character from the Palestinian demographic threat. It reacted the weak moral position of a presidential administration on its way out the door, not the sort of definitive negotiating terms that might have emerged at its beginning. In any case, Israel rejected the content of Kerry's speech out of hand, though it was welcomed by the PA and Arab countries, contradicting once more the widespread belief that Palestinians and/or Arabs resist US peace initiatives or plans. In fact, the Arab League had convened in a show of support for Kerry soon after his appointment as Secretary of State, in response to US administration efforts to resume Palestinian-Israeli negotiations after talks came to a standstill in October 2010 over the settlement issue. In its meeting on the 30th of April 2013, the Arab League amended its 2002 peace initiative, which had received no response from Israel, to recognize the principle of land swaps, thereby allowing for the Israeli annexation of so-called settlement blocks, Ariel, Mar el Adumim and Gush Etzion, later included in Kerry's now proposal, though the idea was met with nothing but rejection and disdain in Israel. 175. In the only language EY understand, 2017, Nathan Roll concludes that the US has neither the interest nor motivation to exert pressure on its ally, nor to change the status quo and create a Palestinian state, no matter how small, poor, and strategically inconsequential. That is why US policy remains designed to thwart actions that would raise the cost of the status quo, and so in effect sustains it. 26. At the same time, negotiations will never succeed or produce any meaningful result as long as there are no set negotiating terms and agreed upon principles. Roll argues that the US should at least support the UN in clearly defining the terms of any future agreement. 27. But the prevailing Israeli consensus irrationally fears this prospect, although any terms the US supported would surely be favorable to Israel. Netanyahu clearly expressed this fear. 28. In his 2016 speech to the AIPAC Policy Conference, stating, "Those terms would undoubtedly be stacked against us. EY always are." 29 is quote sums up years of unyielding Israeli rejection of any diplomatic initiative that might later set the terms for serious negotiation, which Israel apparently believes should be denied solely by its own power and explicit moinens. Act first agree later to kick off the 7th round of US peace initiatives. President Trump created a 4-person team responsible for the Palestine issue. ERST Member of the group was Jared Kushner, 30, his son-in-law, whose credentials were being the son of a real estate developer, a donor to Israeli settlements and a strong supporter of Netanyahu who identifies wholly and openly with Israel. To be fair to Kushner, his knowledge of the region and the Palestine issue comes from prodigious reading by his own estimation, as many as 20 books about the Middle East. 31. Even assuming the truth of this assertion, one shudders to imagine which books he read. As Trump's senior advisor and son-in-law, he was received like a king in Arab countries. A second member of the group was David Friedman, a right-wing Zionist whose close relationship with Trump dates back to his time as a bankruptcy lawyer. Despite his reality TV persona, Trump is a terrible businessman who has declared bankruptcy more than once. It is a reasonable assumption that Friedman, appointed by Trump to serve as U.S. ambassador to Israel, played a major role in writing the text of the eventual deal. In 176. Cooperation with Netanyahu. The other two members of the group were Jason Greenblatt, 32, and Avi Berkowitz, 33. Trump administration began the implementation of its peace deal before it had even been announced, a clever strategy concocted by the aforementioned group designed to gauge the reactions of the Arab world and the international community at each step. The administration clearly saw the Arab world through the eyes of certain Gulf state rulers, which led them to underestimate negative reactions. For example, there is more than one indication that the UAE was consulted on the plan ahead of time and expressed enthusiastic support for it. ERST step of the deal, which the US took on the 31st of August 2018, was to end US financial assistance to UNRWA, CUing a full third of their organization's $1 billion annual budget. 34. In practical terms, the suspension of aid to the organization meant that the US no longer recognized the existence of a Palestinian refugee issue. UNRWA is not a non-governmental organization or a charity, but a UN organization established, with the support of the US, pursuant to Resolution 194 in 1948, which calls for the return of Palestinian refugees and was followed by dozens of UN resolutions affirming the right of return for refugees. A second step, taken on the 6th of December 2017, was to relocate the US Embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. On the face of it, the move appeared as simply the belated execution of a 1995 congressional act requiring the US to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of the Jewish state no later than May 1999. However, the act also allowed the president to waive implementation every 6 months, which is what every US president had done since 1995. A waiver provision itself, in a law drawn by pro-Israel members of Congress, and its use by every successive administration re-acted a common understanding that implementing the highly controversial act would undermine the US administration's credibility as a mediator on Israel-Palestine. Trump openly dismissed warnings about the potential consequences of the move, RST saying that the world would not end, then bragging that he had moved the embassy and nothing had happened. A third step in implementing the Trump-Netanyahu deal was to close the PLO office in Washington, D.C. 35. 177. When no appropriate Arab or Palestinian reaction followed from the previous actions, the fourth step was taken. On the 18th of November 2019, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo declared that the U.S. no longer considered Israeli settlements in the West Bank to be in violation of international law, 36, meaning that as far as the American administration was concerned, the West Bank was not occupied territory. With this declaration, Pompeo, who is no less ideologically extreme than the four group members described above, did away with the permanent status issues that were ostensibly the subject of negotiations, abandoning the negotiation framework in place since the Oslo Declaration of Principles. Is marked a radical share in the U.S. position on Israeli settlements in the occupied territories. In 1979, the Carter administration abstained from voting on Security Council Resolution for 4637 condemning the establishment of settlements in the occupied territories on the grounds that they were a serious obstacle to peace in the Middle East and had no legal basis, in a departure from the usual US practice of vetoing condemnations of Israeli policy. A US position nearly shared under Reagan, whose staunch support for Israel extended to its West Bank settlements. On the 2nd of February 1981, around 2 weeks after officially taking office, Reagan expressed opposition to the Carter administration's position on settlements, saying that to him, they were not illegal. Needless to say, Begin's government welcomed Reagan's informal declaration, but the latter administration warned him of potential repercussions. He subsequently retracted his declaration on the basis of their 1978 Hansel Memorandum 38, which had concluded that while Israel may undertake, in the occupied territories, actions necessary to meet its military needs, the establishment of the civilian settlements in those territories is inconsistent with international law. In addition, Reagan called continued Israeli settlement construction provocative and unnecessary, and as part of his peace initiative, he called on Israel to halt new settlements in September 1982. Multiple presidential statements affirmed that the settlements posed an obstacle to peace talks, and throughout Reagan's tenure, the State Department's official legal position on settlement expansion was based on their Hansel Memorandum 39. 178. A Clinton administration officially supported the principle of land for peace and similarly considered Israeli settlements an obstacle to peace, though it did make exemptions for natural growth needs which allowed Israel to continue settlement construction in the West Bank and occupied East Jerusalem. 40 George W. Bush also expressed concerns about settlement expansion, saying that it impeded efforts towards peace and urging Israel to keep its commitment to dissolve illegal settlements. 41 At that time, Israel made a formal distinction between legal and illegal settlements. It is an important point, from the perspective of international law and for a colonized people, there is no such thing as a legal settlement, but if the determination of the legality or illegality of settlements rests with the Israeli government, this represents a de facto extension of Israeli law to the occupied territories and, in turn, their effective annexation by stealth. After Obama took office in 2009, the official American position should a refusal to freeze settlements in the West Bank and East Jerusalem was no longer simply a theoretical obstacle to peace. A freeze was widely understood to be a practical precondition for the success of Israeli-Palestinian peace negotiations. 42 His position, which made resumption of negotiations contingent on the freezing of settlements, was unprecedented but short-lived. While Abbas clung to it, Obama later abandoned this precondition, and when in 2011, the UN Security Council issued a resolution calling for the cessation of settlement construction, the US vetoed it. 43 Much later, during a 2016 Security Council session, the US representative declined to exercise her veto over a resolution condemning settlement activity. 44 But this was towards the end of Obama's term, when he began to more openly convey his frustration with Netanyahu. In a 2017 interview with Israeli TV, Obama explicitly said that Netanyahu's policy of supporting settlements in the occupied territories made a future Palestinian state impossible. 45 Considering this historical record, Pompeo's 2019 declaration that the settlements were legal obviously re-acted a radical share. In practical terms, Trump's incremental introduction of his proposal was neither foolish nor accidental. Adopting a right-wing Zionist approach, the four-person team drawing up the plan deliberately sought to take some of the permanent status issues of the Oslo Accords borders, including 179 settlements, Jerusalem and refugees off the table, relieving Israel of the burden of pursuing a fair, lasting solution through negotiations and formally nullifying the Oslo Accords. A Palestinian president is right to be angry and correct to say that there is nothing left for him to negotiate. He nevertheless continues to cling improbably to negotiations as an exclusive strategy, even though successful talks hinge on the vicissitudes of domestic elections and politics in Israel and the US. Despite his recognition of the observable negative outcomes of that precarious strategy, Abbas is in complete denial of the relationship between means and ends, strategy and outcomes. In a closed-door meeting with American senators to discuss the Trump administration's Middle East peace plan, Kushner warned the PA that if it did not agree to negotiate on the basis of the deal of the century, the Trump administration would support Israel's unilateral annexation of settlements and enclaves in the West Bank. 46 Yet, the end result of the so-called deal of the century is annexation. Kushner's ultimatum encapsulated the perverse dilemma facing Palestinians: negotiate based on a plan calling for the annexation of settlements, or the settlements will be annexed. A text, no need to read between the lines. In the title of this chapter, I used the term Trump-Netanyahu deal to refer to Trump's self-professed vision. 47 I chose that description not only because the content of the plan reacts Netanyahu's thinking, and not only because Netanyahu and the Israeli right sought to take advantage of Trump's presence in the White House to achieve important political gains. I chose it as well because this was a partisan deal intended to help both Trump and Netanyahu in their respective domestic elections. Trump burnished Netanyahu's image among the Israeli right and mainstream by granting his ideas cachet in the White House and, by extension, some Arab capitals. Similarly, by airing Netanyahu, Trump courted his own electoral base, especially its extreme evangelical, Christian Zionist core. In this respect, the Trump-Netanyahu deal is instructive, illustrating how the transnational populist right operates on the level of international relations and showing how the capitalist logic of real estate development underlies their actions of the government of a superpower with no commitment to international legitimacy. First, the deal exemplifies a power-based approach, in which power means the ability to impose one's will, even if it means trampling. 180. International laws prohibiting the forceful annexation of others' land or violating previous agreements and commitments. Second, the deal fully embraces the Israeli narrative, espousing all the absurdities inherent in the contemporary politicization of the biblical narrative. Third, the language of the deal is a throwback to the colonial rhetoric of the 19th century, communicating its Misbego-en proposals in egregiously paternalistic and condescending terms. A deal gives Israel complete custodianship of the occupied territories, allowing it continued control over security in the state of Palestine, while simultaneously aspiring to give Palestinians responsibility for as much of their internal security as possible. In other words, the state of Palestine's full sovereign responsibility for even its own internal security remains uncertain, a mere potentiality, and even if it were realized, it would not include control of crossings and borders, according to the deal. The State of Israel will maintain overriding security responsibility for the State of Palestine, with the aspiration that the Palestinians will be responsible for as much of their internal security as possible, subject to the provisions of this vision. A State of Israel will work diligently to minimize its security footprint in the State of Palestine according to the principle that the more the State of Palestine does, the less the State of Israel will have to do. 48 It goes on to suggest that Jordan assist the PA to combat terrorism. A deal subsequently elaborates, should the State of Palestine fail to meet all or any of the security criteria at any time, the State of Israel will have the right to reverse the process outlined above. A State of Israel's security footprint in all or parts of the State of Palestine will then increase as a result of the State of Israel's determination of its expanded security needs and the time needed to address them. 49 is means that Israel will unilaterally determine its security needs and how and when it will act on them, a succinct description of the current status quo. In short, the deal nominally recognizes the Palestinian Authority as a state, but gives it no sovereignty, as Israel can decide when and how to cross their borders of this state and conduct security operations on its territory. 181. E-documents overall language is the most abysmal sort of colonial speak one could possibly end in the present day, promising rewards for Palestinians if they meet Israel's subjective standards and punishing them by reversing the entire process if they meet with Israeli disapproval. Such language can no longer be legitimately used in any other context, inextricably linked as it is to fallacious ideas of racial supremacy and their civilizing missions of the 19th century that asserted that only white men were qualified to judge the interests of colonized people. Colonized people were treated according to similar perceptions of how children should be raised or socialized, where they must be punished and rewarded until they learn to submit, in the hope that they would eventually become qualified to govern themselves as much as possible. Is paternalism extends to culture and education. E-document rebutes Israeli bromides about violence and terrorism to Trump, quoting him as though he were an intellectual or philosopher. As President Trump has said, peace can never take root in an environment where violence is tolerated, funded and even rewarded. Therefore, it is very important that education focuses on peace to ensure that future generations are committed to peace and to ensure that the Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement can endure. Promoting a culture of peace will be an important element of the Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement, with the goal of creating an environment that embraces the values of coexistence and mutual respect throughout the region. 50. Necessity of education for peace is thus emphasized, but only Palestinian educational curricula are spotlighted as a source of concern. No similar pressure is brought to bear on Israel to purge its educational curricula of racism and hostility towards Arabs and Palestinians or of the Zionist religious narrative about the history of the land, although numerous Israeli polls indicate that racism is widespread among Israeli Jewish youth. Accord Center, for example, recently conducted a comprehensive study, published by the Hebrew University, assessing youth public opinion in Israel, a 2021 Index for Shared Society Progress in Youth, based on a survey in May and July 2020 of 1,091 teenage boys and girls aged 16 to 18 from secular Jewish, religious Jewish, ultra-Orthodox, Haredi, and Arab backgrounds. A survey found that 2/3, 66%, of ultra-Orthodox youth, Haredi. 182. Youth, 42% of religious Jewish youth and a quarter, 24%, of secular Jewish youth expressed feelings of fear and hatred towards Arabs. Similarly, a majority of ultra-Orthodox youth and nearly half of religious Jewish youth hold negative stereotypes of Arabs. 58.2% of Haredi youth, 41.3% of the religious Jewish youth and 19.4% of the secular Jewish youth expressed this view. Moreover, a high percentage, 49%, of religious Jewish youth and 23% of secular Jewish youth expressed support for denying Arabs the right to vote, Haredim were not asked this question. 51's endings are consistent with general Jewish public opinion in Israeli society. For example, the results of the 2021 Israeli Pluralism Index conducted by the Jewish People Policy Institute reveal a preference among a majority of religious Jews for Israel to be more Jewish, Haredi, 92%, religious, 89%, national religious, 87%. A survey reports only a tiny minority of Jews in Israel, 1%, would prefer that Israel cease to be a Jewish state and become a state of equal citizens. Endings also show that almost 2/3, 61%, and more than half, 51%, of right and center-right Jews, respectively, agree that the Jewish state must give legal preference to Jews over non-Jews. 52. Trump Netanyahu document espouses the right-wing national religious Israeli narrative that casts the Torah as some combination of international law, contemporary political document and official title deed as if God, like Trump, were a real estate broker. In contrast, it contains not a single word re-acting the Palestinian narrative. Israeli narrative is not distinguished or identified as such, since for the authors of this document, it is the default narrative, the rule to which everything else is an exception. A national religious Jewish fundamentalism pervades the entire text. For Judaism, Jerusalem is where Mount Moriah, or the Temple Mount, as it later came to be called, is located. According to Jewish tradition, it was there that Abraham nearly sacrificed his son, Isaac, until God intervened. Centuries later, Jerusalem became the political center of the Jewish people when King David united the 12 tribes of Israel, making the city the capital and spiritual center of their Jewish people, which it has remained for nearly 3,000 years. King David's son, King Solomon, built the first temple on Mount Moriah. According to Jewish tradition, inside the temple, within there 183 Holy of Holies, were stored the original 10 Commandments, revealed by God to Moses at Mount Sinai. The first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians in 586 BC. A second temple was built atop the same mountain and stood until it was destroyed by the Romans in 70 AD. However, Jerusalem never lost its holiness to the Jewish people. It remains the direction to which Jews throughout the world turn in prayer and the destination of Jewish pilgrimage. Every year, on the 9th day of the Jewish month of Av, Jews fast, mourn and commemorate the destruction of the two temples. Although Jews pray today at the western wall of the Wailing Wall, which was a retaining wall of the Second Temple, the Temple Mount itself is the holiest site in Judaism. There are nearly 700 separate references to Jerusalem in the Hebrew Bible. For 100 generations, the hopes and dreams of the Jewish people have been encapsulated by the words, "Next year in Jerusalem." 53 is lengthy quote had to be cited in its entirety to demonstrate the absurdity of a text that is ostensibly an international policy document serving as the basis for a future Palestinian-Israeli peace treaty. It is more akin to a Knesset speech by the head of the nationalist religious party, its language reminiscent of the Israeli propaganda found in pamphlets passed out to evangelical tourists in Jerusalem. The document does not fail to remind us that the Torah includes 700 references to Jerusalem, whereas the Quran makes no mention of it, referring only to the Al-Aqsa Mosque in the context of the Prophet Muhammad's nocturnal journey from Mecca to Jerusalem. Al-Isra, it was only the later Umayyad Caliphate that showed interest in Jerusalem, it notes. 54 For this trivial reason, Jerusalem must remain the undivided capital of Israel. The only thing missing is the low Y label eternal, so beloved by the Israeli right. Yet, contemporary Jerusalem is neither the biblical nor the Quranic city. The fact that Jews consider it a spiritual center does not make it the capital of Israel, just as the presence of Muslim and Christian holy sites does not turn it into a Muslim or Christian capital. Jerusalem could be the capital of two states created by a political solution and still include holy places for Jews, Christians and Muslims. Religious matters are beyond our scope here, but it must be stressed that with this document, the Trump administration not only 184 embraced a fundamentalist religious discourse based on the Torah, which is not exactly a Parki-St text, but effectively aligned itself with the extreme position of a speciesi and decidedly modern religious strand of Judaism to the exclusion of all others. 55 It is imprudent, to say the least, for a global superpower to approach relations between modern states based on politicized interpretations of religious texts. States, sovereignty, legitimacy, international law, colonialism, the right to self-determination and related terms and phrases describe and are grounded in modern human endeavors and thought, not biblical. If the text of the Torah were taken as a reference for contemporary politics, genocide would be legitimate and even divinely ordained. A superpower whose constitution enshrines the separation of church and state invoked scripture as a political argument in an official diplomatic text, and this deployment of religious text for colonial purposes passed unremarked by the international community. Even from a religious Jewish perspective, this vision constitutes a partisan abuse of religion. What is new and noteworthy in this case is the US President's endorsement, thanks to the presence of someone like Trump in the White House. The document similarly appropriates Israel's secular narrative of its connection to the region and views security through the Israeli lens. Israel, which occupies the land of others, is cast as a victim throughout the document, which makes repeated references to the plight of Israelis with nary a word about the ongoing suffering of Palestinians since the Nakba. If it gestures to Palestinian suffering, it is in the context of mistakes made by their leaders and always with the implication that they brought suffering on themselves. At the same time, the text refers repeatedly to Israeli concessions to Palestinians over the past decades. Of particular note is the following passage: "No government should be asked to compromise the safety and security of its citizens." This is especially true for the State of Israel, a country that since its establishment has faced, and continues to face, enemies that call for its annihilation. Israel has also had the bitter experience of withdrawing from territories that were then used to launch attacks against it. 56E document thus adopts the narrative of overriding Israeli victimhood, even though it is in fact the victimizer in this context, occupying the land of 185 others and engaging in decades of aggressive warfare, from the 1956 war against Egypt to the 1967 war, which Israel deceptively portrays as a defensive war, and the assault and invasion of Lebanon in 1982 and 2006. Arab states did wage a war in 1948, but only after the Zionist movement unilaterally declared a state in Palestine and began seizing land and cleansing it of its indigenous inhabitants, in areas of both the future Arab and Jewish states as designated by the UN partition plan. The only offensive Arab war was the 1973 war. Scholar and public intellectual Noam Chomsky did not consider this an aggressive war against Israel, however, 57, but rather an offensive to recover occupied Arab territory after Israel had rejected all international initiatives and resolutions calling for its withdrawal. The word occupation, in the sense of seizing a territory by force, 58 does not appear in the text. What are we talking about, then? The document refers to the occupied territories as a territory captured in a defensive war, 59 in reference to the 1967 war. It echoes Israeli terminology from the early years of the occupation, when the Israeli government called the occupied territories shtarim muzarkim, captured or seized territories. Hebrew was officially translated into Arabic as Al-Manatik al-Mudara, administered regions, before the Israeli authorities began using the biblical designation of Judea and Samaria. As the terms suggest, the intention was for Israel to administer these regions until peace negotiations were initiated, the occupied territories were held hostage, and the ransom was peace with the Arab states, on Israeli terms, of course. In referring to the occupied territories as captured, a term used by no other country, the document's authors thus borrowed the original Hebrew wording. This is a particularly apt illustration of the way the document deliberately distorts language with the aim of distorting reality. Reading the document through from beginning to end transports the reader from the realm of international politics and con-ICT resolution to a different world entirely, that of real estate development, which the plan's authors apparently believe is a vocation, a higher calling and political panacea, capable of truly improving people's lives and delivering the kind of real, practical solutions that politicians can only dream of. E-text is shot through with the kind of jargon Trump might use to hype his latest project. To support this new development, the Economic Development Program will identify financing for the construction of restaurants, shops, hotels, cultural 186 centers, and other tourism facilities within this zone. Would that differ from the existing settlement economic zones that already employ Palestinians? Israel exploits the impoverished Palestinian workforce, who are paid salaries that range from 30 to 40% of the legal minimum wage a day, not only by importing workers to Israel but also in the West Bank itself. 20 settlement industrial zones were established along with hundreds of Israeli factories and dozens of agricultural settlements that cultivate over 9,000 hectares of occupied West Bank land. 60 fast-track accessibility to the Muslim holy shrines should be developed and maintained. See details of this area, including, without limitation, taxation and zoning should be negotiated between the parties. 61E document that begins with invocations of the Torah wraps up with details about tourism, recreation, restaurants and hotels. The idea of a contemporary international diplomatic text citing scripture is no less ridiculous than a peace initiative that promises the construction of restaurants. EY may as well have taken the farce to its logical conclusion and provided menu suggestions. Fallacies. A text articulating the Trump-Netanyahu vision is riddled with gross fallacies that insult the reader's intelligence. First, it must be recognized that the State of Israel has already withdrawn from at least 88% of the territory it captured in 1967. 62 here, the authors are referring to the withdrawal from Sinai, implemented within the framework of the peace treaty with Egypt. The remaining 12% comprises the occupied Palestinian territories and the Golan Heights. In order to emphasize the significance of Israeli concessions, the text lumps all Arabs together, something the authors seem to do when it suits their purposes. But is Israel ready to negotiate over the occupied territories with all Arab countries combined? Of course not. Israel rejected the Arab Peace Initiative unanimously supported by the Arab League at the March 2002 Beirut summit. Later amended by the Arab League to further accommodate the U.S. administration, the plan proposed peace, normalizing relations with Israel and the principle of land swaps. Second, the State of Palestine will benefit from special access to certain designated facilities at the State of Israel's Haifa and Ashdod ports, with an efficient means of exporting and importing goods into and out of the state. 187. Of Palestine without compromising Israel's security. 63. Where is the fallacy? It is that Palestinians already use these two ports for imports and exports, and this is a source of profit for Israel. Indeed, it is an artifact of the occupation. If Palestinians had been allowed to build a port in Gaza, they would not be using the ports of Haifa and Ashdod, though that would be a potential point of cooperation between two sovereign states. In other words, this is not a bounty given to the Palestinians pursuant to an agreement with Israel, it is part and parcel of the reality of occupation. Occupation. Concerning the territorial issue, the text states that the State of Israel and the United States do not believe the State of Israel is legally bound to provide the Palestinians with 100% of pre-1967 territory, i.e., the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, a belief that is consistent with United Nations Security Council Resolution 242. His vision is a fair compromise and contemplates a Palestinian state that encompasses territory reasonably comparable in size to their territory of the West Bank and Gaza pre-1967. 64. A fallacy lies in the deceptive reference to less than 100% of the territory occupied in 1967 as a fair compromise. Yet, for Palestinians, the territorial claim at issue is 100% of all of Palestine, which came under a British mandate or World War I and includes both the land occupied in 1948 and the remaining territory occupied in 1967. Accepting the 100% of West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and the Gaza Strip as the sole territories of a Palestinian state is already a historical compromise, a significant political concession that meets Israel halfway. It consists of accepting an independent state with sovereignty over only 22% of the land of Palestine. Furthermore, according to the document, a peace treaty granting the Palestinians less than 100% of the territories occupied in 1967 is consistent with Resolution 242, an assertion premised entirely on the Israeli reading of that resolution, which hinges on a distinction between their territories occupied in 1967, implying all territories, and territories occupied in 1967, implying some. 65e precise wording in the English language version of the resolution is withdrawal of Israeli armed forces territories occupied in the recent CON-ICT. In context, there was no need for their 188 Donite article, the territories, to clarify that the entirety of the land was meant, because the territory in question is already denied by the phrase in the recent CON-ICT, i.e., the 1967 war, is already differentiates these territories from other territories occupied in other conflicts and wars. Moreover, the French version of the resolution, as well as the Spanish, Russian and Chinese versions, uses the donite article. Fourth, an additional fallacy appears in the same part of the document. E-text says that the land swaps may include part of the triangle, a region consisting of 3 areas with about in villages and towns. 66E triangle was occupied in 1948 and under the 1949 armistice agreement with Jordan and should have been returned to Amman, but Israel held onto it in violation of the armistice borders and granted the Arabs living there Israeli citizenship. Today they number about 350,000. It is these communities that the text proposes to return to the Palestinian Authority, but the objective is not to return land per se, but to reduce the number of Arab citizens in Israel. In other words, what is envisioned is not a land swap, but a targeted population transfer of Arab residents in order to preserve Israel's Jewish character. Indeed, this is why some on the Israeli right like Avigdor Lieberman 67 have long advocated trading this area in a future peace treaty. According to the document, peace should not demand the uprooting of people Arab or Jew from their homes. Such a construct, which is more likely to lead to civil unrest, runs counter to the idea of co-existence. 68 But no political compromise has ever proposed expelling any Arabs from their homes. EY were already expelled and displaced in 1948, many of them fled to the East Bank in Jordan or the 1967 war, while others have continued to be expelled from their homes since then under the policy of house demolitions in Jerusalem and elsewhere. 69 What is really meant, then, by the assertion that no one, Arab or Jew, should be uprooted from their homes is to preclude Israel's withdrawal from West Bank settlements. E-language refers to both Jews and Arabs to make it appear as though letting settlers stay in their illegally acquired homes is somehow a just compromise. E-text proposes equal status between settlers in their homes and Arabs whose land was occupied, establishing a false legal and moral equivalency between the occupier and the occupied, the armed robber and the robbery victim. 189. Map 7.1a, B and C, E-Palestinian Triangle. What this glaring fallacy indicates is that the deal does not foresee Israeli withdrawal from any settlement. In this respect, it goes further than even. 190. Sharon, whose 2005 unilateral withdrawal from Gaza forced settlers to leave their homes in the illegal settlements of the Gaza Strip, and one-ups the Zionism of most Israeli politicians, who have already recognized that withdrawal from some settlements will be part of a lasting negotiated solution. The document refers to enclaves, i.e., settlements within Palestinian agglomerations, to distinguish them from the border settlement clusters previously mentioned. A compromise mentioned in the text supposedly provides the Palestinians already uprooted from their homes, that is, refugees, and their right to return with solutions. The document states, Israeli-Palestinian peace agreement shall provide for a complete end and release of any and all claims relating to refugee or immigration status. There shall be no right of return by or absorption of any Palestinian refugee into the State of Israel. 70 language is categorical, definitively excluding the right of return from the agenda of negotiations. There is not even the barest attempt to pay lip service to refugees' rights along the line of proposals made in post-Oslo Committee negotiations to allow the few thousand 1948 refugees still alive to return, but without their offspring. Regarding the Palestinian right of return to PA territories, the document limits it to Palestinian refugees without a permanent place of residence. These cases are to be brought before a joint Palestinian-Israeli committee, which shall review each application in light of Israeli security considerations and the ability of Palestine to absorb them, with both factors assessed using Israeli-NED criteria. The document also envisions persuading Islamic countries to absorb 5,000 Palestinian refugees per year. 71 on state and sovereignty. The Trump-Netanyahu deal promises the Palestinians a state, but for the text's authors, this is a simple semantic issue. They merely christen the existing Palestinian Authority as a state. It is reminiscent of Netanyahu's talk at Bar-Ilan University in 2009. Sooner Obama RST took office and Netanyahu had to agree to use the term Palestinian state. He delivered a long speech informing his audience of this change, using language almost identical to that of Trump's document. I told President Obama in Washington that if we could agree on the substance, then the terminology would not pose a problem. And here is the substance that I now state clearly, if we receive this. 191. Guarantee regarding demilitarization and Israel's security needs, and if the Palestinians recognize Israel as the state of the Jewish people, then we will be ready in a future peace agreement to reach a solution where a demilitarized Palestinian state exists alongside the Jewish state. 72. In other words, labels are unimportant, call it a state or whatever you want, as long as the nature of this state meets Israel's conditions. A Palestinian state was acceptable to Netanyahu if it remained unarmed and allowed Israel to determine its borders, manage internal security and continue to protect the numerous Israeli settlement enclaves and all roads leading to them, according to the terms articulated in the Trump document. Unlike Netanyahu, however, the document does not avoid controversial political terms. The authors thought it appropriate to theorize on the matter of sovereignty and share their thoughts. Sovereignty is an amorphous concept that has evolved over time. With growing interdependence, each nation chooses to interact with other nations by entering into agreements that set parameters essential to each nation. The notion that sovereignty is a static and consistently dened term has been an unnecessary stumbling block in past negotiations. Pragmatic and operational concerns that affect security and prosperity are what is most important. 73 is amateurish philosophizing on the lack of the importance of sovereignty is not directed at Israel, of course with the intention, for example, of encouraging it to alter its understanding of sovereignty to accommodate the idea of a state for all its citizens or a binational state, or to allow the international community to intervene in its nuclear weapons program, but, obviously, at the Palestinians. In asserting the amorphous nature of sovereignty, the document is effectively telling Palestinians not worry about such trying matters. For these real estate developers, what should matter to the occupied Palestinians is work and prosperity. His vision of state building encapsulates a real estate mindset par excellence. The authors cast themselves as hard-headed businessmen seeking to sway the population, who do not and should not care about politics, against their extremists, preventing prosperity under occupation by 192. Insisting on invoking ideas like sovereignty, independence, liberation and other allegedly static and inexorable concepts. In another passage on sovereignty, the document states, the State of Israel will be responsible for security at all international crossings into the State of Palestine. With respect to the Rafah crossing, specie arrangements will be agreed upon between the Arab Republic of Egypt and the State of Israel to accomplish the security needs contemplated by this vision. The State of Israel will continue to maintain control over the airspace and the electromagnetic spectrum west of the Jordan River. 74. Document additionally grants Israel static and inexorable sovereignty over airspace and borders, saying, the State of Israel will retain sovereignty over territorial waters, which are vital to Israel's security and which provide stability to the region. 75. It also gives Israel continued sovereignty over wells, which may not be dug without Israeli authorization because groundwater in the State of Palestine is a shared resource. Following a long paragraph, the document adds, additional funding will support the development of new wastewater treatment facilities in the West Bank and Gaza, putting an end to the ongoing public health risk posed by untreated wastewater. Is treated water will be reused, creating vast supplies of affordable water for agricultural and industrial use. 76. Israel's sovereignty, then, is not lo und ned. It extends to the heavens and even to the water beneath the earth. In exchange, the lucky Palestinians will receive support for the development of wastewater treatment facilities. While brimming with references to Israeli security, the document contains not a single reference to Palestinian security. Settlement enclaves, the brown spots on Map 7.2, which are mentioned in the document's appendices and labeled on the map as enclave communities, are to be protected by the Israeli army even though they are located within the purported Palestinian state, as are all the roads identified on the map as Israeli access roads, which lead to these settlements. His deal amounts to nothing more than a formalization of the status quo in the framework of a nominal state. Is Israel's vision of a Palestinian state, with a bit of land thrown into what are now the Palestinian-controlled areas A and B. 77. In short, if you expand areas A and B by 20 to 30%, but 193. Retain Israeli sovereignty and settlement enclaves, then call the existing crossings along Israel's separation wall borders, then you've got yourself their deal of the century. Official Arab reactions to the vision were muted at best. Some Arab states openly supported the initiative, 78 saying the dangerous precedent of encouraging Israel to persist in its intransigence and diplomacy through fait accompli, which Trump had accepted. While European reactions varied, there was a clear difference between the critical responses of continental Europe and the opportunist position of the UK under Boris Johnson, whose support for the Trump-Netanyahu deal exemplified not only its persistent uncritical support of Israel, but also its unconditional submission to US foreign policy dictates, apparently having learned nothing from the Anglo-American invasion of Iraq. 79. The UK has not yet come to terms with its historical responsibility for the question of Palestine and certain other calamities of the Arab Mashreq. In any case, European official positions proved to have no real force and cannot be relied on until efforts succeed to establish a strong base of supporters of Palestinian rights among European publics. Map 7.2, Map of Palestine according to Trump's vision, with settlement enclaves indicated. 194. 195. Source: White House, Peace to Prosperity, a vision to improve their Lives of the Palestinian and Israeli People, January 2020, accessed at hps:/bit.ly/2s6c3rt. Map 7.3, Map of Palestine according to Trump's vision compared to areas A, B, and C as delineated in the post-Oslo Cairo Agreement. 196. 197. Perhaps the one arguably positive aspect of Trump's initiative is that it conclusively dispelled the stubborn myth that the Oslo project represented a peace or political process. The initiative made it starkly evident that those with power want to impose their vision on the weaker side, which has no meaningful bargaining power or ability to resist. At least the weaker party is free to describe the conditions imposed upon them using any nomenclature it pleases. They can call it a state or even an empire if they wish. For the Israeli right, the most important element of Trump's vision is its recognition that the reality on the ground has radically changed in the 53 years since the 1967 war. The deal neither denies this reality nor promotes their illusion that the clock can be turned back. Is unusual American-Israeli candor could spur Palestinians to explore and articulate new strategies, and the changing position of the Palestinian cause in official Arab discourse and politics is another reason to think creatively about the future. Even if another U.S. administration drops the Trump-Netanyahu deal, what incentives will it have to generate and act on ideas that are closer to justice, when some Arab regimes are normalizing their relations with Israel? It seems clear that any real politics of liberation cannot rely on the influence of Arab regimes and will need to directly address public opinion in the US and elsewhere. It requires a justice-oriented discourse. One is chapter builds on a lecture I delivered at the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies on the 3rd of February 2020 on President Trump and Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu's plan to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. See Azmi Bishra, Trump-Netanyahu deal. The American-Israeli right-wing plan to end the Palestinian cause in a historical context, Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies YouTube channel, the 6th February 2020, accessed at hp://bit.ly/2HOR7WJ2 on the 23rd of October 1995. Both houses of Congress overwhelmingly passed their Jerusalem Embassy Act mandating that the United States Embassy in Israel should be established in Jerusalem no later than the 31st of May 1999. However, the act allowed the president to invoke a 6-month, renewable waiver of the application of the law on a national security grounds, and Presidents Clinton, Bush and Obama repeatedly did so. On the 6th of December 2017, Trump recognized Jerusalem as Israel's capital and ordered the relocation of the embassy, which was officially completed on the 14th of May 2018. See S.1322 Jerusalem Embassy Act of 1995, Congress.Government, accessed at hp://bit.ly/2Hoshero3. Shamir insisted that Israel would not negotiate, directly or indirectly, with the PLO or anyone affiliated with it, and further demanded the exclusion of Palestinians residing in East Jerusalem from the negotiations. The PLO agreed to these terms, limiting itself to presenting a list of Palestinians from the occupied territories to participate in their 198 negotiations. Before initiating talks, Israel further demanded that the Palestinian delegation formally acknowledge that the scope of negotiations be limited to autonomy in the Palestinian territories. Feeling that this rigid approach would make talks impossible, former Secretary of State James Baker sent a message to the Israeli government essentially telling them to call us when you are serious about peace. See Omer's L. Friedman, Baker rebukes Israel on peace terms, New York Times, the 14th of June 1990, accessed at hps://niti.ms/3uqqt5. President George H.W. Bush subsequently indicated that he would look into other ways to proceed towards a peace plan because we're not going to sit here and do nothing. George H.W. Bush, President's New Conference, June 29, 1990, in Public Papers of the President of the United States, George Bush, 1990, Book I, the 1st January to the 30th of June 1990, Washington, D.C., United States Government Printing Office. 1991, page 882. In September 1991, tensions between Bush and Shamir reached a breaking point. Hours before the Israeli ambassador to the U.S. presented a formal request for the loan guarantees, Bush took the unusual step of holding a press conference, during which he asked Congress to hold off on any action on the request for 120 days. He had previously called on Israel to freeze settlements in the occupied territories and indicated that he would not consider Israeli requests for loan guarantees until the Madrid Peace Conference, slated for October 1991. He also threatened to exercise his presidential veto if Congress denied his request, but that proved unnecessary. He additionally refused to promise that the loan guarantees would be approved the 120 days, conditioning them on progress at the Madrid Peace Conference and an end to settlements. Shamir ignored these threats, although he made conciliatory gestures to the U.S. and affirmed his support of the proposed peace conference. He asserted that Israel would be ready to GHT a buyer. Biela if it came to that. A loan guarantee issue persisted at the Madrid conference as Bush continued to make them contingent on an end to settlement construction, which his administration considered a hindrance to peace. Ultimately, Bush withheld the loan guarantees for a year, until Rabin's election in the summer of 1992. These developments include the fraught debate around populism and neoliberalism and their interconnectedness, the consequences of previous U.S. wars abroad and disagreement over what they mean, and the responses to Trump's election, which itself was a reaction to Obama's presidency. Although it is important to understand the Trump-Netanyahu deal within the U.S. context, such consideration is outside the scope of this study. Trump's vision is indeed a result of fractures in U.S. domestic politics, populist and white supremacist reactions to Obama's term, the rising influence of Christian Zionism in American evangelicalism, and the increasing electoral and foreign policy activism of radical evangelical churches and their links with the Israeli lobby, with Sinai Kant. Implications for the Middle East. 5. Echoing Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs Abir Eban's comment that the Arabs never miss an opportunity to miss an opportunity, Saudi Prince Bandar bin Sultan told Yasser Arafat a few hours before the latter's meeting with President Clinton on the 2nd of January 2001, in which Arafat would either accept or reject the Clinton parameters for a no settlement. 199. Since 1948, every time we've had something on the table we say no. And we say yes. When we say yes, it's not on the table anymore. And we have to deal with something less. Isn't it about time we said yes? Marhugh Brodsky, Mahmoud Abbas and the Persistence of Palestinian Mythology, Guardian, the 19th of May 2011, accessed at hps://bit.ly/3GSZY15.